and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to make a dress that I'm so excited about. I got this fabric for $5 at the thrift store and I think it is so pretty. I wanted to have a bustier bodice and a double circle skirt. I love circle skirts and I've always wanted to make a double circle skirt because I think it would look so good. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. And now let's get started. I began by cutting out my patterns. I cut everything out of the main fabric as well as the lining. It was very convenient because these curtains that I bought came with two layers, the patterned one and the white one, so I could just cut it out once and I would get both the lining and the main piece. When I bought this, it also came with two pieces, so I had plenty of fabric to work with. I just cut out the bodice and the straps in the beginning because I was going to do the skirt later. I also strategically cut out the pieces so the fabric patterns would be exactly where I wanted it on the bodice. First, I sewed the straps, which I did by folding very long straps of fabric long ways in half and sewed along the edge. I wanted them to be wide straps, so I made sure to not make it too narrow. Then I turned it right side out using a safety pin and ironed it flat. I repeated this 4 times to make 4 straps so that I can tie them up in a bow. Then I went on to the bodice pieces, which I started by putting interfacing on all the main pieces. I contemplated putting them on the lining as well for more structure, but I was afraid I would run out, so I decided not to. It ended up being plenty structured, so there was no need anyways. Next, I did the simple task of sewing up all the side seams of the bodice. I did this for the main pieces and the lining pieces and ironed all the seams towards the outside. After that, I worked on the cuffs where I sewed up the 2 side pieces, top stitched it, and then sewed the top piece on, and then top stitched that as well. I did this for both cups and for the lining. And this is just me showing you where to top stitch. Then I took the bodice pieces I was working on earlier and put them right sides together and sewed all along the top. And I was going to understitch them, but then I realized that I completely forgot about the straps, so I took 2 of the straps and placed them where I wanted them along the back of the bodice. I had to unpick where I already sewed that I could insert the straps. The other 2 straps along the front are going to go on the cup, so we don't have to worry about them quite yet. So I just sewed them in place and then I could understitch it by putting the seam allowance towards the lining and top stitching it in place. For the foam in the cups, I normally use bra foam, but I always felt like it wasn't dense enough and found it hard to sew through, so this time I used craft foam. If you're wondering why it's blue, that is because for some reason blue foam was cheaper than all the other colors. I cut out the foam pieces with seam allowance only along the outer edge of the cups and zigzag stitched the pieces together. And then the zigzag stitch on my sewing machine kept skipping stitches, so I resorted to hand sewing. But when I looked it up, it said I should try to change my needle, so that's what I did. Then the zigzag stitch worked, which made me really happy. And as you just saw, I sewed it to the lining piece along the bottom where we left the seam allowance, and then this time I didn't forget the straps and placed them on the right side of the main cup pieces and sewed it on before putting the 2 cups right sides together and sewing along the top. Now I could finally attach the cups to the bodice by putting them right sides together and sewing along the curve. I made sure to take my time with this so that it looks nice and clean. I also made boning channels on all the side seams by sewing stitches on the bodice so that I could just insert the bonings between the lining and the main fabric. And this is how it looks now. I've inserted all the boning, which I ironed and rounded the corners before putting in. I also made sure that it didn't go into the bottom seam allowance for when we sew on the skirt. At this point, I also tried it on to make sure it was fitting good before going on to the skirt. For the skirt, I made a double circle skirt, which is basically just 2 circles. I took my waist measurement and divided by 12 to get my radius. I cut out one full circle skirt and 2 half circles because that's what I could do with the fabric I had left, and I knew I was going to have to cut the second circle in half anyways to insert the zipper. I made the length of the skirt 16 3/4 inches, which includes the seam allowance for the hem. I also cut out the same pieces out of the lining, which was pretty easy because they were already together. I only added a lining because I knew I wanted to try adding in horsehair braid to give it an extra poof, and I didn't want the stitching to be visible from the outside. I'd never used horsehair braid before this, so I was pretty excited for that. And these are how all my pieces looked. I put together the skirt by sewing up the side seams using a French seam. This is where you put them wrong sides together, sew, and then cut the seam allowance and flip it to sew them right sides together so that you are left with no raw edges. I put them together so that the whole circle skirt was sandwiched between the 2 half circle skirts. I did the same thing for the lining and then sewed the waist seams of the 2 skirts together to make it easier to sew it to the bodice. Then I pinned the skirt and the bodice right sides together and sewed it together to attach the skirt and bodice. I made sure to line up my seams in the skirt and the bodice. This is when I could see how the dress was really starting to come together, and I was so happy with how it was looking. I didn't like my fabric fraying so much, so I finished the waist seam with some bias tape. And next, I could sew the zipper. I find that the easiest way to add the zipper is to first lay it out how the zipper will look after it's sewn in, and then just flip each side over to sew it in. To sew the other side, I first zip it closed and mark where the top and waist seams are so that I can match it when sewing the other side. I also find it very helpful to iron out the teeth of the zipper before I sew it in so that it's easier to sew closer using the zipper foot. It was kind of tricky to sew it in because the skirt was so big, but I took my time and made sure I liked how it turned out. So this is how it looks right now. I really like how it's coming together, but I think it would look really good if I added like a bow in the back. So that's what I'm gonna do next. Making the bow was really simple. It was just a rectangle that I sewed in a loop and I folded each side over to make the bow. I also added interfacing for extra stiffness. I wanted it double layered, so I did the same thing with a smaller rectangle and then put them on top of each other. And then I got a much smaller piece to put along the middle after scrunching it together. I put it together with some hot glue, and to put it on the skirt, I hand sewed some snap buttons because if I wanted it to go in the back of the skirt, it would get in the way of the zipper, so I needed to make it removable. This way, if I don't want the bow, I could also just take it off. I put the dress on my dress form and marked where the snap button should go so that they perfectly line up. I was getting so close to finishing. All I needed to do was to hem the skirt and add the horsehair braid. To hem the skirt, I just did a basic rolled hem all along the circumference of the main skirt. And then while I was sewing, my bobbin ran out, so I had to refill it. Then I could continue on with my hemming. To add the horsehair braid, I first finished the raw edge with bias tape. Then I sewed it to the right side of the lining of the skirt. I sewed it about 1.5 inches up to make sure that it would be shorter than the main skirt so that it wouldn't be visible when worn. Then I finished the end edge and flipped it to the wrong side so that I could sew the top of the horsehair braid to the skirt. I really liked how it just formed into the shape of the circle skirt. I've never used horsehair braid before, but I can definitely see myself using it again in the future. And as the final step, I made another bow, though much smaller, to make it into a hair clip to match my dress. And then it was done! I absolutely love how it turned out, and I can easily say that this is my favorite dress I have ever made. There are normally a few things I don't like about the clothes I sew, but for this dress, I have no complaints. I am just in love with how it turned out, and I can't wait for an occasion to wear it out. If you enjoyed this video, it would mean so much to me if you could like and subscribe.